if they do overturn his tariffs, this would have extreme implications for the administration. I think it was something like they would have to return $165 billion. You can imagine the bureaucratic nightmare.
I'm getting a headache just thinking about the person who would have to do that.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Hey. I feel like it's becoming a cliche that every single week we say, another big week in Washington, D.C. I mean, it just is.
Yeah, it's an unrelenting pace of news and yeah, no rest for the wicked.
Absolutely. And of course, a massive week of developments for the Middle East as well, with President Trump's ceasefire plan and him heading to the region, something we'll be talking about in the coming weeks quite a lot. But, that's something that we're going to discuss. And we wanted to actually jump right into another topic that is really important for President Trump that we're gonna be looking at in the coming weeks and over the year, really, the next year ahead, which is the Supreme Court and the role that this term of the Supreme Court will play in deciding really important policies and President Trump's agenda. Remember that, in a system of government like the US, the courts play a large role, and there's been a lot of question about what role this Supreme Court in particular will play in either supporting, if you will, or pushing back on President Trump's agenda.
Yeah, I think this is one of the underlying themes of his presidency. So much of his policy rests on court challenges to executive orders and letting some of these policies play out as they're challenged in the court. And as you said, Sumi, this term in particular is full of high stakes political confrontations, and we're going to see this court wade through cases that will determine the extent and the scope of his presidential power. Some cultural issues that could have some lasting implications about where we are as a country. So there's lots to dig into around this.
I think we should point out as well that one of the lasting legacies of President Trump's first term in office was getting to appoint three justices to the
Yeah.
Supreme Court. Like, I remember traveling around in that 2016 campaign and people saying to me their reason for voting for Donald Trump was because of who he would put on to the Supreme Court, because there was this confluence of events. Very rare that a president would get to appoint three. And in doing so, he changed the balance of power in the court. So it's now resolutely conservative leaning on the bench. It's nine judges. So therefore, I mean, it's very clever if you're thinking about it strategically from the second Trump administration, because, we've talked so much, haven't we, about how in those intervening 4 years, a lot of the people around President Trump were going through the Constitution, going through the law books, seeing where they could push things to the nth degree and almost having those memos ready for when they got into power this time around. And they're ready to take those challenges to the Supreme Court, and they have the case law there. And then when they get there, they have a conservative leaning bench. So there's an element of confidence, in a lot of the policies that you guys are talking about there from this administration, that they know and they anticipate there'll be legal challenges to them. And they know they'll probably end up in the Supreme Court. And they've been relatively confident and successful thus far that when they get to the Supreme Court, the ruling comes in their favor. So there's quite a long game at play here for some of what the president's team have been trying to do, particularly around immigration, I think.
I think, that's a really important point that you make. The balance of the court is so significant. It's something President Trump himself points to all the time and takes credit for. And at the moment, it is a 6-3 conservative majority on the bench. And I think it's also important as we're thinking about the issues, which we're going to dig into some of these cases, is that President Trump and his administration have made massive use of something called the shadow docket or the emergency docket. And this is really significant. And what it essentially is how some really important cases are decided on a quick basis. So without the full oral arguments or written briefs that you're used to when the Supreme Court is deciding on a case. And these are cases that are brought by a state or someone who has lost, let's say, in lower courts, and that is then appealed up to the Supreme Court. And I just have the numbers here because I think, it's so significant how often the Trump administration has actually made use of this emergency docket. And by the end of last week, the court had granted 20 of President Trump's requests to block lower court orders. And the court had ruled against the administration in these emergency cases just 3 times. And to put that in perspective, I was looking at the numbers here during the 16 years of the Bush and Obama administrations. Um, the federal government only asked for emergency, so only made use of this emergency docket 8 times. So that gives you a sense of just how much the Trump administration has made use of getting immediate relief through this emergency docket. And importantly, to Katrina's point about thinking about how these cases will be argued on policy, they give us some indication of where the justices stand on these issues as well and which way they might be leaning.
Yeah, and just to add to your point about the emergency docket, I think that sort of this summer, seeing a preview of, what they're going to be talking about this term, how frequently they're going to have to weigh into President Trump's policy, just how politically divisive and tense it's been. We saw just in some of the rulings in the last term, some of those really sharply worded dissents, right? And so the Chief Justice, John Roberts, had said it was important that they take a break this summer just to let cooler heads prevail and take some time to really level out and rebalance the court. But unfortunately, they didn't get much of a break because they were pulled into, this emergency docket by the Trump administration so much. So I expect we'll see a lot more of that this term with regard to some of the dissents.
It's really interesting for me to observe this as well in how many of the cases that they've heard or are going to hear are related to administration policies as opposed to something that originates in the community and kind of bubbles up as a question of an interpretation of the Constitution. When we think back to cases that have come through relating to, people wanting to bake cakes for same sex marriage celebrations and so on, these kind of cases that are about fundamental rights of Americans and the things that are enshrined in the Constitution and were written in one era and have to be interpreted in another era. You contrast that with what we're seeing now, which, the court will hear things like President Trump's tariffs plan. The court will hear things like whether he can remove inspectors from federal agencies, whether he can cut the federal workforce. So a lot of quite different and in a way quite technical things that they have to hear that are related to a very different part of life and society in America than what would traditionally expect the Supreme Court to be hearing.
I was just going to say, I think, let's start off with the tariffs case, because I think this is one of the more important cases for this administration in terms of, their agenda, right? This is at the core of the president's agenda. This is something he campaigned on, and they will decide whether he has the power to impose these sweeping global tariffs or whether this is a power left to Congress, right? And so, I think the question is if they do overturn his tariffs, this would have extreme implications for the administration. I think it was something like they would have to return $165 billion in customs duties that they've already collected this year. And you can imagine the bureaucratic
I mean,
nightmare.
I'm getting a headache just thinking about the person who would have to do that. What an awful job.
Right, and especially considering they've laid off so many people in the federal
Yeah.
government, I
Yeah.
can't imagine that it not be any sort of quick process. And, yeah, again, I think it's one of the cases at the heart of the Trump administration's foreign policy and domestic agenda, just because so much of what he does has to do with his tariff regime.
Absolutely. And we can't forget that, this case in particular is actually so central to President Trump's economic agenda. I mean, we've talked on this pod so often about how tariffs are actually one of those few really fundamental beliefs for President Trump. And his administration see it within his executive power to be able to issue tariffs on countries around the world and to be able to change those tariff rates and to be able to negotiate with countries on what those tariff rates will be, negotiate up or negotiate down. And they absolutely see that not only within President Trump's power, but also as fundamental to his agenda to, as he has said, rebuilding American manufacturing by the goal, as he has put it, is to put tariffs on products coming from other countries, as we know, so that manufacturing is boosted here in the U.S. And not only is it the headache of imagining how you recoup some of those costs, but it also would kind of really drive a wedge into President Trump's entire plan that he has set out for, his 4 years in office.
The interesting thing here is the power play involved, right? I mean, you think about all those trade deals that were, you think about the trade deal between Europe and the US that got to 7 or 8 rounds of negotiations, even the deal that Obama managed to do in the Pacific region. All of those had to then go to Congress if they got that far. I mean, the European one didn't get that far to be passed or failed, but they have to be rubber stamped by Congress. And so the heart of the case that's going to the Supreme Court is whether the president has overstepped that power. So it speaks to a whole pile of things that are going on in Washington, D.C., I think, beyond just the tariffs regime that is so core to President Trump's part of his policy of this term in office. When you think how he's come up against Congress and some would say is trying to undermine and weaken the role of Congress, particularly on budgetary matters. So we see it with this attempt to set trade policy without involving Congress in the usual way. We've also seen it with the passage of the budgets, the pressure that the president is putting on Republicans, and then the rescinding things that have already been agreed to. So there's a lot of people that will be watching this case for the precedent that it may set for the congressional role and the role as laid out, through generations as to how there is a check on power there for things beyond just trade policy as well. So, I think it's going to be when people will be out with the pen and paper and magnifying glass, because I suspect it also will be a very, very lengthy judgment when we get that far.
Yeah, and just to add one sort of final point on that, I think I agree with both of everything you both have said in terms of
Oh, that's no
um
fun.
um uh I mean, there's no doubt that this is central to Trump's second term and his legacy, really. But I also think it's important to remember that, there are trade deals out there that still aren't done, that this administration is still negotiating. We could talk about Mark Carney coming down from Canada just to get in front of the president and basically refocus his attention on trying to get a trade deal over the line with Canada. There are plenty of countries out there that are going to be watching, not just, us domestically, right? Because so much of the power he wields has to do with his ability to impose these tariffs. And so if he loses that power, that could really shift the dynamic globally as well in terms of how he is negotiating on the world stage.
You'd have to imagine it being watched very closely in Brazil and India and China, but those countries in particular that have these penalizing level of tariffs on them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm also really interested in the case that questions the legitimacy or the authority, let's say, of the president to be able to fire commissioners or members of boards of independent agencies. And this is a question of the firing of a Democratic member of the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. And this is something that has been kind of pushed back or pushed up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is taking this up. And it is a question here again of the extent of the president's power. The Justice Department argues that the president can fire board members for any reason, essentially, that is standing in the way of the president's agenda. And in this case, I actually was looking at this quote a little bit earlier in the day, what the government's argument is here. And the quote is literally, "The president and the government suffer irreparable harm when courts transfer even some of that executive power to officers beyond the president's control." So that is actually a statement that can be lifted and put in many of these cases that are underlining the president's power or questioning the extent of the president's power. But it just goes to show that when it comes to some of these independent agencies that do things like regulate labor relations or employer-employee discrimination, that the president and his administration see this as absolutely within their right to be able to play a role in shaping or be the one that shapes the makeup of these boards. And that actually goes against, the tradition of these agencies. If you think about, for example, how he's questioned the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, and Jerome Powell has said, well, he cannot fire me in the position that I am in. And we saw in the past that the president and his administration suggested that maybe some fraud was carried out in the building of the Federal Reserve's or the Federal Reserve new construction here in Washington D.C. That has quieted down, but they made that point to say that this is part of the president's power, and this case will be central to deciding much of what the president and his administration see as within their realm in terms of who they can and fire and how they can shape these boards.
Yeah, this case regarding the FTC firing in particular also could see the court overturn an FDR era precedent that permitted Congress to protect independent agencies, as you said, Sumi, from the whims of the White House. So, I mean, the other thing is this court has signaled that it'd be willing to. So the question is whether they will actually do it, and again, just the scope of presidential power, um, and this White House's ability to fire and hire, where as however they see fit.
There also is the chilling effect of all of this, which we spoke on a recent pod as well, didn't we? Because the case you're talking about there, the Federal Trade Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter, although that has yet to be heard, the court has said that her removal can go ahead. So she is out of office at this point. But you look then at the case of Lisa Cook, the Federal Reserve Governor, who President Trump has also tried to remove. That case is winding its way towards the Supreme Court, but it has ruled that she can stay in her role pending the outcome of the case. So, for anyone trying to navigate these things, it also is kind of hard to figure out where it's going to go and what's going to happen in the meantime. But, if you're removed from a role and that stays pending a hearing, what do you do? Do you sit at home with no income waiting to see if you're reinstated? And then what life is ahead for you if you are reinstated? Or do you have to just move on and, find another job in the meantime? We've seen that, haven't we, with some of the lower level firings and removals as well, where you just lose those people forever really from the civil service because they have to move on and get work elsewhere. So there'll be a lot of people watching those cases for very many reasons as well. Scholars and just ordinary people waiting to see what the employment future holds for them.
And I would add just one of the reasons there is so much scrutiny and perhaps confusion over which way the court might lean in some of these cases is precisely because of that shadow docket. And as I mentioned earlier, some of these decisions that have been kind of pushed up from a lower court and decided via this emergency docket. Again, that means that you don't have the full oral hearings that you do for a case that is heard during the Supreme Court's term, and you don't have the written opinions. And those are so critical to giving us an insight into the thinking of the justices on a number of issues. And when that isn't present, it leaves many, as you said, Katrina, to really wonder which way the court will decide and why. Are they leading towards granting the president more powers, as we understand in this case of the FTC board member seems to be the case? Or, is this something that with more consideration and with hearings from both parties that they could actually come down on the other side? This is something that's going to simply have to play out in this term.
And, with regard to the case of Fed Governor Lisa Cook, this one is particularly important related to the Rebecca Slaughter case, but also different because it calls into question the independence of the Federal Reserve, which is the U.S. central bank, right? And whether, there can be political interference in monetary policy and what that would lead to, what that sort of political meddling could cause. Would that if the Federal Reserve's independence was undermined.
This week, we've been looking here at the BBC and some of our programs at the Supreme Court already hearing actually oral arguments on conversion therapy. This is this discredited and highly controversial practice of trying to change someone's sexual orientation or their gender identification. And there are more than 20 states that ban this practice. And the Supreme Court actually did hear arguments on this. There's a Christian therapist in Colorado, one of the states that bans this practice, that said that her free speech rights have actually been violated by the fact that Colorado does not allow for a minor's sexual orientation to be or gender identity to be changed via conversion therapy. And this is again one of those really interesting social issues that's being brought forward by the court. And of course, so many social issues have been in generations past decided by the Supreme Court. But this one is going to be, I think, much trickier for the court than perhaps some of the others, simply because it is a practice that is discredited and seen very skeptically by the vast majority of people.
Yeah, the other social issue, if you want to use that kind of term, that the court will hear this year is relating to the constitutionality of laws, testing the constitutionality of laws that bar transgender women and girls from participating on girls and women's sports teams. You know, we've heard a lot about this from this administration and indeed from various court cases in the last couple of years. So this one, the court said it would take it up over the summer. So it's expected to be heard sometime this term or the next term, relating to two cases coming together originating in Idaho and West Virginia, which had barred transgender girls and women from taking part in female sports teams. So that case is one of the more traditional, I suppose, Supreme Court cases where it's a test of the constitutionality of existing laws around issues that affect huge swathes potentially of the American public, rather than what we've been discussing, which is something that a narrow group like an executive or the administration are trying to action on. So those are other cases. I mean, there are plenty more as well, aren't there, where there'll be a huge amount of focus.
But one other thing I just wanted to mention, that I expect to see this term is just some of the tension between the Supreme Court and the lower federal courts. There's a lot of what seems to be resentment about some of the emergency rulings that the Supreme Court issued this summer. Some of them without any sort of reasoning, behind their decisions, and I think that has borne out some frustration with some of those lower courts in terms of some of these cases making their way through the court system. So I think we should see more of that this term as well.
Yeah, it's a tense and lucrative time to be a lawyer in America, you'd imagine, with all of these cases.
It really is. And I think something else I'm going to be looking out for is just how the court is perceived in the country. You know, we've talked a lot about how the Supreme Court has lost, if you look at polls across the US among voters, lost its credibility as being a quote unquote neutral institution. At this incredibly polarized time in the US, more and more there is a sense that the Supreme Court is part of the president's agenda because of that 6-3 conservative majority. And there's a real frustration among many Democrats that they believe that the court is not necessarily representing and calling balls and strikes, if you will, in the way that it was intended to.
Well, interesting times ahead. We will be talking about the outcome of some of those cases, no doubt, on this podcast as the weeks and months roll on, and indeed keeping a keen eye on developments in the Middle East, which has been so front and center all of this week. But the busy life of Washington goes on. We haven't even talked about how the government is still shut down and looks like remaining to be so for some time still to come. So no doubt that'll be on our docket next week when we meet again for more news from the president's path. Good to see you guys.
Have a good one. See you guys.
Bye. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so please leave us a comment below or email us at path@bbc.co.uk.